Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the second webinar in our four-part series put on by the University of California Center for Climate, Health, and Equity that overall present on evidence and innovations to confront the climate health crisis. My name is Dr. Sapna Toratil, and I am the managing director for the center, which was co-founded by Dr. Ariane Tehrani and Dr. Sherry Weiser. I'm pleased to kick off the webinar today. Our mission in the center is to harness the expertise and leadership of the health sector to drive ambitious climate action for health and health action for climate. The center is based at the University of California, San Francisco, and spans all 10 UC campuses and 5 health systems with over 100 affiliated faculty. We have 4 strategic work streams: research, education, health system sustainability and policy, as well as special initiatives like our new UC Climate Change and Mental Health Council. I want to thank both the UCSF Office of Sustainability as well as the UCSF Academic Senate Committee on Sustainability for their support and contributions for this webinar series. So today, we'll be focusing on oceans and sea level rise and the health impacts of these changes. We have 2 more webinars after this. On Thursday, May 12th, next month, our speakers will address how climate change is impacting mental health. And our last webinar of the spring series on June 14th will be about our food systems and their relationship to climate change. It's my pleasure to now introduce today's moderator, Tarik Benmarhnia. Tarik is a co-chair for our research pillar in the Center for Climate, Health, and Equity. He's also an environmental epidemiologist with a joint appointment at the University of California, San Diego's Scripps Institution of Oceanography and School of Medicine. He finished his PhD in epidemiology jointly from the University of Montreal and Paris Sud, and a postdoctoral position at McGill University with the Institute for Health and Social Policy. His work is combining epidemiological methods with environmental and econometric models with a specific focus on health policies and environmental justice. I'll turn it over to you now, Tarik.
Thank you, Sapna, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm very happy to moderate this session this afternoon. So for our second session of this webinar series, we thought it would be important to focus on this very important topic on changing oceans and sea level rise in the context of climate change and viability, and try to focus on health impacts and also impacts on communities. So we'll start by introducing our fantastic 3 speakers today. So we'll start with Kiya Bibby, who is a senior science officer at the Ocean Science Trust, OST, where she's leading the Legislative Science Service Program. So since joining OST, she has worked on a range of topics, including microplastics, equity and living shorelines, and the halibut fishery. Kiya also holds a Master of Environmental Science and Management from the Brand School at UC Santa Barbara and a BA in Biology from Lewis and Clark College. Before joining the OST team in 2019, Kiya also served as the Associate Director of Development for UC Santa Barbara. Our second speaker will be Julio Garcia. So Julio Garcia is the Rise South City Executive Director. Julio founded Rise South City in fall 2021, and this aims at creating dialogues with our frontline communities about climate change and social equity issues. So Rise South City also promotes community resilience, economic equity, and climate stability. Before joining Rise South City, Julio was also the program director for Nuestra Casa in East Palo Alto, responsible for starting Nuestra Casa environmental justice program for the ground up in 2018. And our last speaker would be Tegan Hoffman. So Tegan has more than 25 years building resilient solutions for people, the nature, and the climate. She is presently the executive director for Coastal Quest. And before joining Coastal Quest, she worked for more than 15 years founding and leading Blue Earth Consultants. And she also authored several publications, received numerous, many awards and research grants for her work on community-based, participatory, collaborative governance and capacity building in the US, in the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific on different types of organizations. So Tegan attended the University of California at Berkeley, where she obtained a BS in conservation and resource studies, and an MA and PhD in geography. So before I turn it over to Kiya, who will be speaking first, I also want you to let you know that we will have the 3 speakers like having the talking, and then we will have some time for Q&A. So you will have the opportunity to submit your question in a Q&A, like through the Zoom chat. So you can see on your screen that you have some option for the Q&A. So you can write your questions there. And at the end of the three talks, I would be happy to read your questions for the speakers, and we'll have some time for discussions. So I will turn it over to Kiya now. And thank you. And I hope you have a nice webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Tarik. And I hope later in the talk today we get a chance to hear just a little bit about your research too on this topic. I think it's very relevant to this discussion about oceans and coasts today. I'm going to share my screen for all of you. Great. Like Tarik said, my name's Kiya, and I'm a senior science officer, and I'm coming to you from the California Ocean Science Trust. It's just really great to be here to speak to the UC Center on Climate Health and Equity today. I'm really excited about this program and excited to see how it grows. It's really deeply important to have a research hub dedicated to this topic. And I was talking with some of my OST colleagues about this, just excited to see what kind of new ideas and powerful research comes out of here in the future. Today, I'm going to talk to you about putting a science to policy framing on research at the nexus of oceans and coasts as it relates to climate change and equity and health. And I'll start by telling you a bit more about me and my organization, and I'll talk briefly about the intersection of oceans and climate and health and equity at a very high level, as in, what kind of issues and topics even emerge at this nexus. And I'll share briefly learnings from work we've completed related to this topic. Ocean Science Trust is a nonprofit created by California law, by the California legislature, that recognizes the value of science in supporting California's decisions around ocean and coastal management. We were intentionally designed as a 501c3 nonprofit to be nimble and independent from both academic institutions and the state, although we do have formal links to both. Our founding legislation, the Coastal Ocean Resources Stewardship Act, was passed in 2000, although I'm very happy to share the California legislature recently updated that commitment with passing AB 2287, reaffirming the idea behind our creation and also updating our charge to reflect the expansion of a sustainable blue economy and the need for an equitable climate future. A big part of how we work is by bringing together expertise in different topics or disciplines to provide science advice in service of California's ocean and coastal goals. Our work has 4 core functions, and I'll just give a couple examples because that always helps me understand. We deliver pragmatic science advice or policy guidance to inform state agency policy decisions. We're perhaps most well known for serving as science advisor to the Ocean Protection Council, which is a cabinet level agency in the state government, and for convening the Ocean Protection Council's science advisory team working groups. So as an example, our team is currently working with the OPC to convene scientists from across the state to update sea level rise guidance with new projections for California. We also provide advice to California lawmakers, for example, through briefings or technical assistance. For example, we did a briefing on DDT plus pollution earlier this year. Our founding legislation also gives us a mandate to support graduate education. And lastly, we bring together people and private resources to develop science solutions for the state. A couple of things I would also like to say about how we work. Our portfolio of projects and issues changes in response to state needs, and in particular, the issues where science can be valuable in illuminating a path forward. And as staff, we are experts in policy and process and boundary spanning work, and we are generalists in content. So we work across a lot of different ocean and coastal topics, but we know about translating between science and policymakers. Oops. There we go. We can't address the climate crisis with the same thinking that led us down here, especially if we want an equitable climate future. And we are wrestling with what this means for us in our role as boundaries planners. If you'll permit me this very classic science to policy metaphor of a bridge, this is our role. We're a dot connector between the two. And when I was talking with my colleagues about what we could say in this context, we discussed was how do we build new bridges to accommodate these complex issues? You know, historically on this bridge, you'd see in the ocean space, you'd see classic natural marine science on one side and an agency with an explicitly coastal mandate on the other side. But that model is just not sufficient to accommodate the broadening mandate as agencies and to meet the crisis of this moment. So we really need to think about how we're defining knowledge and science. We need to see new science disciplines, medicine, engineering, new technologies, economics. At OST in particular, we see a void around social science, the whole world of social science. For example, quantitative social science that examines distributions of harms and benefits, qualitative social science that ground truth those learnings via storytelling, but also political ecology and interdisciplinary disciplines like Native American studies. And at OST, we look for where can science or a science-based conversation unlock a new solution or set a path forward through these complex issues. So let's jump into the nexus between oceans and coast, social equity, climate change, and health. And I expect listeners are interested in one of these topics, if not all three. And I will do my very best to stay at the very center of the nexus, but I might have to take a few little detours to related intersections. Why is the ocean important? These are just some critical statistics about the ocean for those of you who might be relatively new to work in ocean or coastal topics, otherwise known as my slide that is making a pitch to any of you who work on the issues of climate and health and equity to please do something related to the ocean, because it's really a critical and needed area of focus. The ocean is critical in shaping our climate and weather. It does this by storing and transporting heat via massive ocean currents. We can credit the primary producers in the ocean for creating half of the oxygen we breathe. 1/3, thinking about the human dimensions, 1/3 of the human population lives along that coast, and that number is increasing. The ocean is our climate buffer. It is responsible for absorbing half of the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels and 90% of the warming from recent decades. Because we all live on land, it's just really easy to forget that this is a connected system. And there's been a lot of really interesting and important work in recent years breaking down the silos between climate science and ocean science, climate movement and the ocean movement, and to shift thinking of the ocean as a victim of climate change but as a place where solutions to the climate crisis can be found. And I just love that positive and hopeful framing. And I also feel like I also need to always include a pretty picture of the ocean, because it just reminds me of what I do. And these issues, honestly, are challenging to work on a day-to-day basis. And I have to be reminded and ground myself in that. So let's talk about some of the negative impacts between oceans and human health. And we're going to talk about the negative before we shift to the positive or benefits. This is from a review paper that I thought was interesting, exploring how ocean pollution impacts human health at a global level. It's a conceptual diagram showing the complex mixture of ocean pollution. We know that ocean pollution is poorly controlled, with most of 80% originating from land-based sources, and contaminated seafood may be most people's main exposure to ocean-based chemical pollutants. I think this framing as an iceberg is really important, because it shows that the plastic pollution issue gets a lot of public visibility, gets a lot of media attention, but it's just one pollution issue that needs to be paid attention to, and it gives you a sense for what other contaminants are of concern. In California, in particular, legacy ocean DDT dumping is an issue, especially in Southern California, of increasing concern. At a global level, ocean pollution is deeply unjust. It falls disproportionately on small island nations, indigenous communities, coastal communities in the global south, and fishing communities worldwide. We have some significant science gaps here. We have a lot we need to learn. But thinking about solutions, experts always point us back to reducing the source of the pollution as close to the source as we can. And if you think about the plastic pollution issue, there's a lot of really exciting work that's been done in California, getting towards that source, some extended producer responsibility and circular economy stuff. I promised to talk about the positive or benefits associated with the ocean related to human health and well-being. And I was excited to be reminded about the upcoming webinar on mental health. And I hope that we're able to discuss ocean and coastal issues on that too. That you may be familiar with research into green spaces, especially urban areas, about their physical and mental health benefits to communities and how those benefits are inequitably distributed. But blue spaces is a new area of research. And actually, I found a bunch of new papers on this topic just as I was preparing this talk, which was great because I looked a couple years ago and there weren't much, and so it's kind of fun to see that and hopeful to see that evolution and more attention being paid. But here's some benefits associated with blue spaces: physical exercise and recreation, mental well-being, a place for socializing and community, a place to gather, and for many people, a sense of place or belonging. That's culturally or even spiritually significant. To ground this in physical benefits in California, actually during some of California's recent climate-forced heat waves in the last couple of years, we've heard stories of people using California's beaches as cooling centers, which makes sense to me. But what that brings up immediately is who can get to the beach. Coastal access is an environmental justice issue in California. So shifting to the nexus between oceans and equity, I just wanted to share some quick takeaways from a report that on equity in California's coastal communities we did a couple years ago, and you can dive deeper if you have more interest. It's a rapid assessment of the scientific literature on marine equity and justice in California. And it was developed through a review of peer review and other literature, along with several informal, semi-structured interviews with experts acknowledged here. Also important to say that in this context, that peer-reviewed literature is not the same as lived experience, but each have a role to play in knowledge development here. Just some of my takeaways from this report that I could offer to this group. One of the things I found most helpful is that my searches kept turning up some really fantastic resources from community-based organizations and environmental justice advocates on best practices for operationalizing equity or how to do meaningful community engagement. And it just really reinforces the value of having this movement led by people who are most impacted by environmental justice issues. Another takeaway was there really wasn't that much peer-reviewed literature on marine equity topics that was specific to California. I found some really great research outside of California that I'm certain we could learn from. But again, at OST, we're really interested to see California's information for California and also California's leadership here. I mentioned before, it reinforced our belief that social science needs more direct integration and also like funding more directly due to marine and coastal funding calls really identify social science as a key piece. There's a whole bunch of knowledge gaps listed in. If you're a grad student starting a new project, this could be a useful reference to identify a topic of interest. But one knowledge gap I'd highlight especially is the lack of research, not just in California, but everywhere, on what strategies lead to more equitable outcomes. And that just seems like a really vital question that we need to ask ourselves and understand more about if we're going to really think about solutions to these issues. A couple of other topics I did find research on. I would just mention connections between critical research on the connection between ships and ports and emissions that impacts low-income communities and communities of color in California. Been some research there. And a topic that I wish had more attention, but there was just like a tiny bit of research, is subsistence fishing and social equity and health intersections on pier fishing communities, like fishing from the pier. I think that could get a lot more attention in both the research and the policy communities in California. And then I kept coming back to coastal access as an issue that was just coming up over and over as an issue related to equity. And I'll just dive a little bit deeper into that, just to remind ourselves that the California coast is in the public trust and access to it is supported by state law. And research tells us that the access is inequitably distributed along economic and racial lines. Coastal residents in California are whiter and wealthier than the rest of California. And given that, we need to shift our thinking from access as only an issue of permissions, but also who can meaningfully get to the coast. So is there transportation to the coast? Is there public transportation? What's the costs when you get there? Is there parking? What's the cost of lodging? Facilities, are there culturally competent facilities that can accommodate families and a range of abilities? And we know new research is coming out, or we know that rising seas will change this picture of access. Some of our beaches are at risk, and that loss of coastal access will impact underserved communities the most. So that points to me for a need to prioritize these broader definitions of access in our adaptation planning in California. So I'll wrap up here. Summarizing our thinking about what these new bridges need, some of which we've covered, I've covered today. We need new science, interdisciplinary science, but new definitions of knowledge. We need science that's co-produced with, not for communities. We need science that's based, applicable to California, but also relevant to the local context within California. We need inclusive science. Do the people working in science and management reflect California? We need fit for purpose, applied and ready for policymakers to use. Is the science politically savvy? Can we think about any limitations in the research that could be misconstrued? And is it policy facing, which to me brings up questions about how it's communicated in a way that is easy to grasp for policymakers. And all of that, thinking about all these questions, wrestling with all these questions can help reaching decision makers and supporting policymakers in tackling their broadening mandates, and also helping engage new policymakers, new agencies, and supporting their coordination. So these are just some of the questions we are wrestling with and our vision for what we need. And I'm hopeful that there's a lot of opportunity to address this with the expertise and energy of the folks on this call and through this new center as well. So I'll stop there, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from the other presenters and into the discussion, and I will pass it over to Tegan.
Great, thanks, Kiya, and thank you for inviting Julio and I to speak today. We're really excited, and what a great turnout. So thank you everyone for taking your lunch break to listen to us and learn about the work that we're doing that is a little bit more action oriented than some of the science to policy work, just experimenting with pilots and solutions on the ground. So someone might need to study some of that to see what's working and not on a more holistic timeline than what we're doing, which is, more real-time evaluation and adaptive management of our approaches. But I wanted to first start off and tell you a little bit about Coastal Quest and the unique partnership that we have with Rise South City. Coastal Quest is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we offer physical sponsorship services to community groups and public-private partnerships and collaboratives and other organizations and support their work that is mission aligned. And Rise South City is one of our fiscally sponsored projects. And we also do a lot of collaborative work together, as you'll see in our presentation. And so we work with communities and governments to build more resilient coasts by increasing science-based planning, improving governance, ensure financing, and project implementation for a just, prosperous, and sustainable future. And some of the priority and most vulnerable communities really are going to have some of the greatest risks and threats to the coast and to their communities. And so we're really wanting to support those organizations with achieving their goals and their priorities. And so we are focused on helping kind of lift up those efforts and offer services as a nonprofit to support project management and grant administration and fundraising, really to achieve multi-benefit climate, biodiversity, human welfare goals that are identified by communities. And so we heard already from Kiya about some of the threats to the coasts and oceans, and going kind of deeper, what's the challenge here? Well, on some levels, there's like a high level political will. The Newsom administration put forth kind of some funding for climate resilience and coastal adaptation, but maybe locally there, maybe is a lack of political will in certain communities, and maybe there isn't capacity or urgency to act in the same way because there's so many other challenges to address. And we know in many places in coastal California and beyond that social, racial, and economic injustices are leading to a disproportionate amount of threats impacting priority communities. And there's this kind of, on top of this limited funding and capacity focused on really supporting the planning and convening and ensuring that there's a voice at the table for some of these priority communities to really be heard about and understand what decision makers understand what they want to prioritize to build a resilient community for their and place where they live. And so our organization is addressing some of those issues. We focus on two broad kind of goals around protecting and enhancing coastal ecosystems, very holistic from nearshore marine all the way up into the watershed, because everything's connected, white water to blue water, and protecting areas that store carbon. We also have a big focus on increasing resilience for vulnerable communities and economies. Again, really focused on the social science and governance piece and building human and financial capacity and effective governance. And so how do we do that? We are doing capacity building programs and knowledge sharing. We run a lot of cohorts and workshops and webinars. We're piloting solutions that are scalable. And I will talk about one particular set of projects and pilots that relate to our strategies. And also share a little bit of a highlight of one of our programs based on something that Kiya mentioned. And then, this financing is really critical. This is like a big challenge, especially in priority communities. And so that's a big part of our strategy, is supporting, getting and pooling funding to get funding on the ground and supporting organizations and communities to get the work done that they want to achieve and help them achieve their goals. We have 4 broad programs, building resilient coastal communities and governments, which is a little bit more holistic in terms of, working communities on different infrastructure and assets that they care about. We have a program on resilient and coasts and protected areas and parks. We actually have a partnership with California state parks, building off what Kiya mentioned about access and recreation on the coast. This is, a really big opportunity and need. So California State Parks owns and manages 25% of the coast of California. And they're basically estimating that if they don't do anything for adaptation planning, that by 2070, 67% of the beaches will be eroded. And so we have a partnership with California State Parks where we are piloting a solution in collaboration with the regional San Diego Coast District at a district scale. And kind of mapping out the vulnerabilities and risks to all the facilities and access and parking lots and trails. And then we've done an extensive amount of community outreach and tribal engagement to get input on what are the priorities to protect. And we've also done a visitation study to really understand who is accessing, what are they accessing, and working in inland communities, looking at heat islands as Kiya mentioned that, whether or not certain days more people from certain areas were visiting state parks, and how to provide more access. And so this project has been really amazing. We're starting the adaptation and feasibility phase of design of solutions, and it's very kind of hands-on and practical with some applied research involved in modeling. So lots of needs for community-driven and action-oriented research and science. We also have programs around protecting and restoring coastal systems and clean coastal water. And all of our programs are very kind of overlapping. And what I want to do the rest of the time today, and Julio is going to talk about our Bay Area Resilience Initiative, where we're really focused on reducing climate change and specifically sea level rise and flood risk impacts on Bay Area communities, and ensuring kind of the economy and ecology is healthy and increase resilience for communities and ecosystems. And so we are doing that by strengthening coastal resilience, and partnering with local governments and building their ability to engage communities and work on resilience issues. And then also our second goal is around increasing coastal resilience funding, and specifically supporting community-based organizations and helping them with access to funding, as well as the projects that they're prioritizing. And the third is really ensuring that the voices of communities are heard and provide support to kind of early stage initiatives to support their projects and efforts. And so just getting a little bit more detailed on the Bay Area, I wanted to show share some facts and figures here. So this is some modeling that the San Francisco Bay Estuary Institute did for the Bay Conservation Development Commission, which is the regulatory agency of the Bay, who's doing a lot of planning right now on adaptation and assessing risk. And here is a map where we can see around the Bay in different scenarios, 3 scenarios, what's the flood risk around the Bay. And you can really see in this map here how this is like kind of the current state. And then, we can see how these different scenarios will be expanding out into communities and flooding. And we saw that, in January, February with the storms, how there was high tides and there was flooding, and some of the rivers and streams were flooding. And so it really had some big impacts. And, recently BCDC had a meeting, and this is their data and information that they shared at this meeting, where they were saying that, if we don't adapt, what's at risk? Well, they're saying 75,000 households are at risk. And of those, 12,000 of the most socially vulnerable, 200,000 jobs, maybe 15,000 businesses are at risk. And this includes, not only the jobs, but access to jobs, and transportation is a challenge. And then we're also at risk in terms of vulnerable acres of our ecosystems, our wetlands, our habitats, our trails. And so they're starting to estimate what is the cost of this risk, and how do we address it, and who is addressing this. And so then this plays into the equity issue. And you can see here in this graphic here, again provided by BCDC, that this big bubble here is basically showing the regional costs to address all of the adaptation. And about half of those costs in blue are haven't been funded yet or started, so about $54 billion. And then you can start to see like which counties are really kind of far behind in addressing their adaptation needs. And so you see Alameda and Contra Costa and Solano are some of the most vulnerable communities and really at need. And in Marin also, there's actually some surprising needs in some of the communities in the Canal District in Marin City, which have been heavily redlined over the years. And I also wanted to share a recent study that many of you might have heard about, that many researchers at UC led, which is called Bay Area Toxic Tides. And basically this is an inventory of toxic sites and what is at risk for flooding. And so these are the sort of analyses that just haven't been, done, and people don't understand the full impacts. They don't know how to remediate. They don't know how to adapt and prioritize which sites to address and which sites not to address. But you can see that these clusters are in communities that are most vulnerable. And at the same time, there's often not funding, political will to address these issues and fully take those solutions on. And so I wanted just to give an example of some of the work we're doing in Santa Clara County. We've been working with them for a number of years. They have more capacity than other counties. We've kind of experimented working with counties that have some capacity, counties that don't, cities, working with CBOs, building more CBO engagement, developing models. And Santa Clara has been a great partner. We've helped them get funding for their county resilience strategy development and curating a community of practice, and supporting a regional CBO collaborative and helping them get some funding as well. And we also, based on their strategy, they identified this toxic tide issue as like a big priority for them. They have 800 sites they'd inventoried having potential sites that they don't understand the impact of sea level rise, and they haven't looked at the groundwater analysis. They've looked at the flood from the bay, but not groundwater. And they want to have a planning process looking at the flooding. These are, the blue is scenarios in different scenarios based on some of the projections that the OPC put forth. And all the yellow dots are these toxic sites, these 800 sites. And the orange and red are all of the different socially vulnerable communities, red being the most vulnerable around the San Jose area. And you can see that those clusters are really, of some of these sites are really in the most vulnerable areas. And so this, not only is there analysis needed on groundwater and modeling needed, but also this community engagement and prioritization and figuring out which sites to clean up and address, remediate, adapt, and roll that out. And so, we're looking for funding for this project, and, the county and the community is ready to go. And so it's just a matter of getting that political will to make it happen, which is really taking the funding. So one of the efforts that we've also been doing is a small grants program where we're supporting 9 early stage leaders on coastal resilience, and Julio's been involved with helping us shape this and select those grantees, as well as representatives from BCDC and BayCan, which is the Bay Area Climate Action Network. We went through and selected this amazing cohort of individuals where we had 19 applicants. We were only able to select 9, and we were able to really get a number of groups in these kind of counties that have been traditionally unrepresented and don't have as much capacity. And so we have these great groups, and most of them are working on issues related to toxic tides, related to sea level rise and pollution and air quality in coastal areas. And we had our first cohort meeting, and we talked about some of the challenges that their communities have been facing real time the last few months, which has we've all seen in the news or been experiencing ourselves. And part of what we talked about with them in kind of a mini focus group was, what are climate and non-climate hazards and stressors in your community, and how well is your community adapting, and what are the barriers and what are the needs, and what resilience project ideas do you have, and what problems, issues are you addressing, and what challenges do you face? And so again, a lot of them talked about flooding, sewage overflow and pollution, some of the infrastructure and social hazards that were a challenge. And that really at the community level, there's really poor, awareness and education and capacity to be resilient and adapt, and that there was a lot of housing insecurity and food insecurity, and this all added to the complexity of the challenge and ability to be resilient, which is, you know, based on what NOAA says, is really the ability of a community to bounce back after a hazardous event, such as hurricane, coastal storms, and flooding. And, you know, we want to think about this not just in terms of like a hazardous event, but also bouncing forward instead of bouncing back. How do we do things differently the next time around so that we are able to respond, you know, in advance of situations where it's, you know, maybe not a disaster, but just preventing that disaster. So we had a great discussion, and we had lots of high-level needs around getting funding, coordinating with local government, getting support for funding was a big issue, and the technical tools and analysis, really wanting support to know what is the data information and impacts that are on the community so that they can then use that data information to develop programs, to write grants, etc. So this is a little picture of our group. We had lots of fun. We're having our next meeting in April, and we are expanding our program, and it's been really exciting. And Julio has been a key part of our cohort and selecting the cohort, and also leading a lot of his own work. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Julio.
Thank you, Tegan. Hello, everyone. And like Tegan say, you know, we appreciate you taking part of your lunch to be here with us. So I've been talking about equity and equality and frontline communities that we call. Part of the work that I've been doing is participate in this, we can say, commissions or studies or groups, and I will expand a little bit on that. And in 2017, I was invited as a representative from East Palo Alto to form the EJ review team for the Bay Area Equity and Social Organization that are here to help develop the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission environmental justice policies. And the commission adopted that in 2019. And now they form part of the laws that govern our bay and shoreline. Why was that important? Because it was the first time that an agency invited members of the community to start drafting these laws and start looking at them. I think one of the important ones that are like that we put there in the equity socially chapter, it was about consistent and early meaningful engagement of communities of color. Often enough, communities who live in the coast, I mean, and I can talk about East Palo Alto, South San Francisco, they're low-income, frontline communities that, you know, that they don't have an opinion of what goes on in their neighborhood. So we did make sure that, you know, the communities got involved in the early permit applications for projects nearby, and to provide information in how will affect these communities. From them, after that, we created the BCDC Environmental Justice Advisory Group that are composed of 5 CBOs in the area, from San Francisco to the Bay Area to San Mateo County, and we are implementing these policies. It's been 2 years, and it's been a lot of work, a lot of back and forth, because it's a government, BCDC overall is a government agency that is governed by state laws and regulations that they need to be binding to. And part of that work is what Tegan presented at the beginning, that I'm part of the Bay Adapt leadership group that is going to implement the Bay Adapt plan. So that's something that will affect the 9 Bay Area counties. And we only have surprisingly like about 4 or 5 small CBOs participating into that. One of the problems that we have issues with, and you know, I appreciate all the work that been done by BCDC, that they provide us with a stipend to be there. Recognize the time that we invest in this, not all the time, but recognize some of the time that we invest with this. And Also, Right South City is leading the San Mateo County Environmental Justice Coalition with the San Mateo County Office of Sustainability. This coalition, we formed composed of CBOs or leaders in the community who are not involved in environmental justice or these issues yet. We're working in housing, social changes and all of that, but they're not involved in environmental justice or climate change specifically. So next slide. Oh, oops. That's okay. So, you know, we have a lot of issues in South San Francisco. And let me tell you about the partnership that we are having right now. Right South City, in partnership with UC Berkeley and Stanford, are working in air quality issues and health issues related to air quality. South San Francisco has one of the highest percentages of bad air in the area. So we're trying to see what the causes are and, you know, related to health issues. And we are definitely, you know, collaborating with Berkeley is helping us with the purple air monitors, and Stanford is helping us pull up the data of that. What I'm gonna do with this data, convert it and start talking to community members about the issues with that. Because it's really important that nonprofits, CBOs, and institutions are working in the same page, not just doing a study in South San Francisco, but just for us is to collaborating with us into bringing this data and this to the community. I think, you know, also we're working with UC Davis in engaging community and education institutions in what is, I mean, translate, I want to say this, translate what is educational or, you know, higher learning papers into community talk, because we don't, I mean, we don't understand, like, you know, I think it's been like researchers and everything that all the research stays right here, but it doesn't come up to the community level. So for us, it's important to start collaborating and keep collaborating with these institutions and be part of that. So let's go to the Colma Creek. Colma Creek is a beautiful, beautiful place, and we have a lot of trash in the Colma Creek. Across the Colma Creek, we had the San Francisco airport, and as you can see in the background, well, you know, is diesel tanks, I believe that they're there, and they're just close to the bay. And in the last picture, in the right side, you can see that it's a company that has a paint outside. All those are in there, and when it's raining, all this is going to be going, you know, down. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So what we need and the opportunities to reduce risk in Colma Creek are, we need to support the efforts and clean up and remove trash there. We're doing that, but it has to be more consistent. We need to create nature-based adaptation to reduce flood risk and remove non-native plants and native species. But the most important part for me is that to educate the community and start working with the community, so the community will be stewards of the creek. So we don't have to do this like big things, like, you know, just calling people or putting flyers. So Earth Day is the 22nd of April and everybody to clean up. No, this has to be consistent. We need to start talking to community members to start taking care of that, because those are reducing, those things are going to be reducing the flood risk in the communities. The opportunities that we have, I think, coordinate efforts in our communities on work that is currently happening on the creek. You cannot believe that, you know, the Army Corps of Engineers is talking to the city of South San Francisco in building a retaining wall on the side, and nobody knows about it. The San Francisco airport, they have their own plans to expand some runaways and work with the community members, and nobody knows about it. So this is something that we as community members need to be at the table and start, you know, making our opinions. Because one thing that I say all the time, if I live in this community, if I work in this community, I'm an expert on this community. So, and reducing risk, we need to be looking at pollution from industrial areas, surveying, researching, and finding solutions and long-term partnerships to stop creek pollutions. And I'm going to talk about just the Colma Creek. It's a lot of creeks in the Bay Area that needs this work and need community involvement. Without community involvement, we're not going to be doing anything. We can do, we can research, we can talk, we can plan, but the last word is community members. So that's the way that we're gonna reduce the flood risk and climate change. And definitely, you know, it's really important for us to start looking at toxic dyes. I think I don't know if I have another slide, so I think that's
Okay,
it.
yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for the three speakers. I would like to thank you particularly for giving a very, very nice overview of this very complex and important topic and highlighting all of the direct and indirect mechanisms through which our health is connected to the ocean and sea level rise. I think it was a very nice overview of all of the different mechanisms and challenges, and also highlighting the importance of engaging with different partners, community-based organizations, and also with very important focus on environmental justice communities. So we have more or less 10 minutes for Q&A, and I will go through the questions from the attendees, and I will start with a question for Kiya. About if you can share, Kiya, some example about an obstacle that you have seen regarding the potential connection between science and policy on this topic in the recent years.
Sure. I think, I'm going to answer that as what I've been encouraged by as far as progress goes. And the obstacle would be speaking different, the challenges around communicating scientific information to policymakers. And I think there's just been a lot of really great work about and best practices developed around science communication. And building off of what Julio said, I think those can apply in many cases and to many different audiences, community groups and communities being one of them. So I think that makes me hopeful and an example of progress in that space.
Excellent. Thank you, Kiya. So together with a specific question for you on the chat, so it's about repeating a specific source of information, but then with another question that I think will be interesting for the audience from Mika Lubansky. So the question is, the toxic tides and other spaces like them around the world are the places Mika is very concerned about as we think about sea level rise. Are there specific groups working to raise local, state, federal, international awareness and helping focus priorities on adaptation and remediation on this topic? There are so many toxic treatment sites and nuclear power plants like Fukushima around the world. So if you can share about this kind of concept of company impact with industrial sites and potential contamination, that would be great. Tiga.
You know, I don't think there's a huge movement in this space. I think it's starting, and I think that some of the work that we're doing and Julio and the groups that we're supporting are starting to raise those issues and try to lift up the priorities in the county to address this in Santa Clara. So I think slowly people are realizing, wow, we have a lot of toxic sites on the coast, and they were built, in the 60s and in the 70s before we thought about sea level rise. And, we just haven't had that aha. So, but I think it's starting where groups are starting to think about it. But it's very early stage. There's not a big movement, and there's not a lot of philanthropic funders supporting that sort of advocacy. Yes. And I think that's a huge issue. And, the state is supporting some of the science and research to get the inventory, to do the groundwater analysis. Now, I think OPC just funded a groundwater analysis to couple the toxic tides study to really see the true impact. So it's like the flooding from the bay and the groundwater. But that's not enough, right? Now we need to look at the solution side. We put out a proposal to do the solution side. I mean, we've been pounding the pavement. I mean, we have a plan, we have county political will, but no money for it. So if someone has, $800,000, we're ready to go. We have a model.
Thank you, Kiya. I agree. And actually, it's connected. There is like two questions maybe for the three of you. I will start by the question from Wendy Max. Hi, Wendy. Wendy asks, where does your funding come from usually? And also, do you work with the state legislature to obtain support to do this work? So that's probably a question for the three of you. And maybe Kiya, you
sure. I'll just jump. Yeah, we're funded by the state executive branch and also private sources and the state legislature.
Yeah.
Maybe,
we're funded with state and federal funds, as well as private philanthropic funds, and we have some corporate donors and settlement funds as well. So a blend, and I think we need more philanthropic donors in this space, because it's going to create the state funders and the federal funders don't want to support this early stage development and planning to get the voices at the table. They'll do, oh, here's $1,000. Oh, here's this to show up. That's not going to cut it. We need, people like Julio, so knowledgeable, talented, catalyzing these amazing projects. He needs, millions of dollars to do the work. Right. And so that's, the landscape needs to mature and the funding needs to mature with it. Julio?
Well, I wish that it was easy, but with a small team of people, I take and say over and over, capacity to write these grants, capacity to do the research behind these grants. To submit a grant is really, really difficult. I mean, to the state or to the federal grant. I mean, it's still lots of requirements that we need to compile, and it's still a lot of time. And when you have a small CBO with 2 or 3 people, that's almost impossible. And reporting is almost impossible to. And like take and say, we knock doors, we walk the pavement in trying to create philanthropic, money. But with out of 10 applications that you submit, 1 probably is funded and is not funded for the money that you need. So you're still always like looking for funding, looking for these small streams of money, doing reporting, and with foundations is the flavor of the month too. Whatever they want to fund, sometimes they move from childcare to school, early school education, from housing to community. So it's never a full stream to implement and to have a program. You cannot do it in 6 months. It takes a couple of years to have a strong program going on in the community. It takes years to engage communities. And that's something that funders and government don't understand, that we do need to work with them.
Thank you so much. So I will also just ask, maybe the last question for the 3 of you, a question from Adriana Supa Fernandez, just whether you noticed any new specific disease or never before seen human health outcome related to these ocean and sea level rise issues in your experience, in your work, if you have any new challenges. Maybe Kiya, if you want to start, if you have any thoughts.
Sure. I remember one of the takeaways from one of that review paper was actually a big research gap around the ocean's contribution to the global burden of disease. There hasn't been a lot of research there. We have a lot we need to learn. And in particular, I don't know much about, but I have heard conversations about how viruses might be transported via ballast water. And ships, and that is an area that I would raise that I don't think gets very much attention at all.
Yeah,
something to keep an eye on.
I would just add, food security and fishing, for example, like if you have climate impacts with some of the harmful algal blooms and some of the diseases, and just off the California coast with, so many of the mammals and kelp and just different fisheries have been diseased, and that affects those ecosystems and the fisheries and the economy, and it also can make those cyanobacteria can make people sick. And so there have been more outbreaks. I mean, look what's happened in Florida with these red tides. I mean, it's been disastrous. And we have had some of those too. So that's just an example. I'd also speak to aquaculture, where there, climate change is definitely impacting the health of species that are being farmed. If they're I think there was like warning systems for some of the mariculture that was being developed all along the coast for oysters and shellfish. And again, if it affects the economy, it can affect human health. So those are just a couple issues, and I think there's quite a bit more.
Julio, would you like to add anything? No. Okay. Thank you. So I'm sorry if there are questions that we didn't have time to address, but what I would suggest is we're going to forward these questions to the speakers, and they may follow up with you later on. So just to make sure, so to in respect of everyone's time, just to kind of wrap up on time. So I just wanted to thank the speaker again for the fantastic presentation, and also thank the audience for joining us today. And I also wanted to remind you that this webinar has been recorded, and the recordings will be soon shared with you. And if you have any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate. I also wanted to encourage you to also look out for the future webinars as part of the UC Center on Health, Climate Health and Equity. And the next one will be on May 25 on a very interesting topic about climate change and mental health. So I encourage you to join us. And and it was great to have this webinar together today. And I hope you have a nice rest of your day. And thank you, big thanks to the speakers again.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.